At first glance, being allowed an allowance without even having to lift a finger on the household work may sound like a dream come true. But living in the same house as my mother-in-law Doris can always get a little bit difficult. All of this is occasionally offset as a 34-year-old web designer by Doris' rehearsed sarcasm. My husband Bobby and I have faced many hardships due to us, basically being polar halves of each other when it comes to work ethic around the home. After marrying, I began freelancing, which my previous employer and myself both thought was a good idea. In return, this has served me well by giving me a regular stream of work from the known people, while saving hundreds of hours on daily commuting and plenty more to put into my household chore. In contrast, Doris continues to hold conservative ideas about the division of labor within marriage. A wife should be a homemaker who dedicates herself first and foremost to her family. It returns regularly, this belief she has in herself, you better believe it, that refuses to even begin absorbing the reality of contemporary spousal partnerships. Doris views my freelance work as small potatoes, not contributing in any meaningful way to our home's bottom line. In between my web design work, I do what little household chores are needed around the house too to make it fair and fun, but Doris is unswayed. Her frustration comes from contrasting the way in which I currently balance work and home with her definition of what is more conventional. She probably sees me as some interloper who rained on her family parade, especially since she has grown more reliant upon Bobby after his dad passed away 4 years ago. The family remains under the roof of my mother's son, and now entirely owned by her after his death to a life insurance settlement. Guest post by Randy Aita. Yes, Menfort said, if you follow along in this household during a typical day, what tends to be highlighted are the differing ways of living and being that so clearly mark an era alien from one another, get together navigating societal norms with each taking turns of the lead. Our small home is efficiently set up for our little family, making a perfect workspace. Though there is sometimes discord amid the beauty, not everyone appreciates live music. It's also a natural meeting spot for my mother-in-law Doris's friends who've lived in this apartment complex close to 30 years. But the arrival of these old friends had always changed our house, and I often found myself morphing into a hostess, serving coffee with sweets during their visits. Ritually, the gaggle of women will discuss their problems over their daughter-in-laws. Amongst all this, there are moments when I begin to chuckle as they describe their grievances. For instance, they talk about one daughter-in-law who frequently retreats to her parents' home over minor disagreements, spending almost half the year away. They label her as financially reckless, lamenting how this behavior leaves their sons bewildered and has even resulted in debt collectors showing up at their doors. These discussions, which often unfold near my workspace, sometimes take a humorous twist. It's almost as if Doris's friends are in an informal competition to see who has the most troublesome daughter-in-law. Compliments about daughters-in-law are rare in these sessions. However, on the rare occasion that one is praised for managing the household efficiently while working, Doris's reaction is notably sour. She dismisses such efforts with a wave of her hand, reducing my work to merely a side job, even as the room fills with laughter. This blend of humor and critique during these gatherings provides a unique insight into the generational differences in expectations and values regarding family roles, highlighting the ongoing challenges of blending traditional expectations with modern family dynamics. Amid the lively discussions and laughter that fill our living room when my mother-in-law Doris hosts her friends, my job often becomes a topic of scrutiny. Doris loudly questions the value of my work, openly wondering about my earnings. This prompts a shift in the conversation to the spending habits of daughters-in-law, highlighting a sharp contrast between their spending and the traditional belief that a husband's income should primarily support the family. The room bursts into laughter, finding humor in the seemingly outdated notion of such expectations. During these moments, I sometimes find myself overwhelmed by the repetitive stories and the dated views expressed. To cope, I slip on my headphones and focus on my work, trying to ignore the undercurrent of belittlement that seems to target the modern-day daughter-in-law, including myself. One evening at a family dinner, when my husband Bobby suggested purchasing a new car, Doris immediately questioned why he needed my approval for such decisions. Despite Bobby's efforts to explain that we make significant decisions together as a family, Doris insisted that since he was the one with a driver's license, he should have the autonomy to choose any car he likes. Caught in this familial tug-of-war, I tactfully deferred the decision back to him, highlighting the complex dynamics at play where Bobby consistently seeks input from both me and his mother before making major choices. This incident underscored an ongoing dynamic in our family. Raised by parents who valued individual decision-making, Bobby believes in avoiding selfish actions. Conversely, Doris, influenced by the more patriarchal behavior of her late husband, clings to the idea that such independence in decision-making is normal. Whenever Bobby seeks my opinion, it inadvertently stirs Doris's irritation, leading her to accuse me of being overly strict. This recurrent theme in our interaction showcases the tension between traditional and contemporary values in our family life, emphasizing the challenges we face in balancing respect for the past with the realities of present-day partnerships. Struggling to find words in response to the critical remarks often made by my mother-in-law, I've realized it's true that I tend to express my concerns rather than make unilateral decisions. To my dismay, during a recent argument, my husband sided with his mother, blaming my vocal nature for his habit of consulting me before taking any action. Several months into our marriage, it became clear that he rarely stood up for me in front of his mother, and even when we were alone, his apologies and assurances that he prioritized our relationship started to ring hollow. This realization deepened with the incident involving the selection of a new car, which cast a long shadow over our relationship. Initially considerate, my husband ultimately failed to support me in front of his mother, raising serious doubts about our future together. I found myself wishing he would not confuse his indecisiveness for kindness, and hoping that Doris would be more straightforward in her communications. A month later, my husband's new car arrived. The excitement was tangible, and he and Doris were thrilled, inviting me for a celebratory drive. However, the mood quickly soured when the cost of the car, a staggering $300,000, was revealed. I confronted my husband about the financial implications of such an extravagant purchase, only to be met with dismissive responses and suggestions to just take out a loan. Doris jumped to his defense, chiding me for questioning the expense since I had, according to her, given him the freedom to make his own choice. Frustrated, I questioned how we could afford such a luxury, but Doris sharply retorted, "It's not like you pay, so you have no right to complain," feeling utterly unheard and marginalized in discussions that directly affected our shared life. I was left feeling isolated within my own home, pondering how to navigate a relationship where my input seemed undervalued and where financial decisions were made with such apparent disregard for joint consultation and responsibility. As I tried to assert that I contribute significantly to our family income through my work, my mother-in-law's reaction was unusually harsh. She dismissed the legitimacy of my earnings, scoffing at what she called my little side job, and insisting it couldn't compare to my husband's substantial salary of over $130,000 a year. Her contempt was palpable, and just as I was about to argue that my income was indeed supportive, I realized my husband had silently withdrawn from the confrontation. Having endured such treatment for too long, I reached my breaking point when my mother-in-law sharply told me, "A daughter-in-law like you should just get out." Her words echoed in my mind, not just as an insult, but as a dismissal of all I had put up with. Angered by her words and deeply disappointed by my husband's indifference, I blamed him for our escalating dispute, attributing it to his chronic indecisiveness. Fed up, I firmly stated, "Understood. Then I will leave." I went to my workspace to gather my computer and essentials. As I was leaving the house, I informed my mother-in-law that I would return later for the rest of my belongings. Her angry gaze bore into me while my husband remained conspicuously absent, hiding in his room. As I crossed the threshold, my mother-in-law's voice rang out, "When you step into this house again, it will be after signing the divorce papers." I walked away without responding, stunned by her abrasive words, something I had never experienced before. I sought refuge at my parents' home. Shaken and unsure, when my mother saw me, she immediately sensed something was wrong and asked what had happened. Struggling to articulate the full extent of the events, I shared my regrets and expressed how much my husband had changed from the man who once deeply cherished me. Discussing the situation with my parents brought some relief, and with no children complicating the scenario, my mother suggested I consider divorce sooner rather than later, especially given my financial independence. Over the weekend, with the support of my father, I began to take the necessary steps towards a new beginning. Contemplating a future that, though uncertain, promised peace and self-respect, I collected my belongings and moved out of the house I had shared with my husband and his mother. They both seemed to avoid the final confrontation. Standing outside my husband's room, I spoke softly, "You took care of me for a long, long time. Can you sign the divorce papers?" I slipped the documents under the door and soon heard his indifferent response. I signed it. "We're done here." Retrieving the signed papers felt like a hollow victory, marking the end of our marriage. I left without a word to my mother-in-law, carrying with me a deep sense of sadness. After 3 years in that house, which held only a handful of happy memories, I decided it was time to move on. I went straight to the city office to submit the divorce papers, hoping that this formal separation on paper would help simplify the end of this chapter in my life. The plan was to temporarily move back to my parents' house and continue my work from there. As I started rebuilding my life independently, my mother suggested I stay with them for a while. It would be less worrying than living alone, she said. My father also expressed his concerns, cautioning that Bobby and his mother might unpredictably decide to visit me. Although I initially thought such scenarios were unlikely, living at my parents' home proved to be comforting. Fortunately, my job's flexibility allowed me to work remotely, which made the decision to extend my stay an easy one. 3 months passed, and just as Bobby and his mother began to fade into distant memories, an unknown number appeared on my phone. Initially hesitant, I wondered if it might be a mistake or an unwanted connection to my past. Trying to reach out after several persistent calls, I finally answered, only to hear my ex-husband's frantic voice on the other end. "Why do you answer the phone?" he asked, sounding perplexed. Prepared to end the conversation swiftly, I replied that since there was no reason for us to communicate further, I was going to hang up. However, his next question caught me off guard. "Wait a minute, why isn't my smartphone working?" he inquired. With little interest, I suggested that he should contact the mobile phone company. But then a thought struck me. I asked him if he had been making regular deposits into the bank account we used to share. Previously, we both contributed to this joint account. My steady salary along with the more variable income from his job selling health products, which was often insufficient due to its performance-based nature. Normally, I topped up the account at the end of each month, but for the last 4 months, only his contributions had been made. It dawned on me that I had left in the middle of the month, and the new car's loan payments might have commenced. My ex-husband fell silent upon this realization. Over the phone, I stated calmly, "I've been managing our household expenses with my income until now. From this point forward, please take care of your living expenses." Internally, I felt the urge to tell him, "You reap what you sow," but I chose to hold back and quietly ended the call. Reflecting on the situation, it occurred to me that my ex-husband had never fully disclosed his actual earnings to his mother. She seemed unaware that our household had been largely supported by my salary post-marriage. Perhaps he was too embarrassed to admit that his wife was the primary earner, despite it being a well-known fact. Basic utilities like electricity and water aren't usually disrupted so easily. This lack of transparency and his avoidance of responsibility highlighted the broader issues that had plagued our relationship. It became clear that mobile phone service was the first luxury to be compromised. One holiday morning, the house intercom buzzed insistently, signaling an issue at the door. My father responded sternly to the visitor, "We don't want to be involved with you anymore. Please leave." Sensing the gravity of the situation, I hurried to the entrance alongside my mother. Through the intercom, we heard the familiar voice of my former mother-in-law pleading for a moment to talk. As I faced her, just as my father had predicted, anger was evident on her face. She immediately launched into accusations upon seeing me, blaming me for not making the usual monthly deposits, which she claimed resulted in the utilities being cut off. We were all taken aback by this accusation, unsure of her meaning. My ex-husband tried to step in, saying, "Mom, stop it. Doris is no longer involved with us." But his mother brushed off his attempt to calm her and continued her tirade. "Bobby earns $7,500. How can this happen?" she exclaimed. I responded quietly, correcting her that $7,500 was my income, not Bobby's. Shocked by this revelation, she turned to my ex-husband, who admitted, albeit reluctantly, that his actual take-home pay was about $7,500. My ex-mother-in-law cocked her head and gave me a stunned look. I told her that I earned it from a conventional wage, not as pocket money. After that, she turned to Bobby and he told her around $7,500. After a period of shocked pause, she startled the hell out of me by suddenly asking, "Doris, how would you like to return near us?" She had threatened to have me removed from the property, and it was near absurd that she would then request I come back. And I replied with a solid no, and said we would not be reconciling. It was an important conversation in which our misinterpretations and money misconceptions had snapped the ties of friendship. I said very clearly, we have been separated for years now, so I do not care. Despite this emphatic no, my ex-mother-in-law insisted that the only way to work things out was with me and Bobby getting back together. And after they dawdled a moment longer, in Spanish so as to not alert me of their intent, my father barked at them and ordered that they leave straight away or else he would call the police. They practically ran out in total fright, as my father firmly said never to return back to our home. Thinking back to the meeting, my mother was obviously irate with him, and so was my dad. Wish he wasn't more than she did. I was relieved that we had distanced ourselves from such arseholes. Years later, I stumbled upon word that an aging mutual friend of my ex-husband had experienced some tough times as a fugitive. He had lost his parents' house, with the land they owned, and moved into a modest flat together with her mom. The new and rarely used car was liquidated, and the revenue directed to pay off the other portion of that loan. Still, having paid off his arrears, Chuck once more demonstrated financial carelessness by gambling away his remaining cash. He ultimately disappeared without a trace. My ex had just put his mother in a home due to diagnosed dementia. The good news is I have a successful career and am living on my own. I have recently started dating a colleague who is well aware of my divorce. He is hardworking, not financially dependent on me, or blowing every last cent he makes, the polar opposite to my ex-husband. Now he and I have never talked about marriage, but I feel really secure in this relationship, convinced that if not now, then someday soon the potential is great.